Good morning or good afternoon. I would like to welcome everyone to the Cisco Support Community Expert Series webcast, Automating Cisco IOS Vulnerability Assessment. We're glad to have you with us. A few housekeeping notes to begin. Today's session is being streamed via audio broadcast and requires that you leave the WebEx media icon on your laptop for the duration of this program. If at any time you delete this icon or get disconnected from audio, you can go to the Communicate menu on the top toolbar and click on Join Audio Broadcast. We encourage you to ask questions at any time during today's event. Simply type your question in the Q&A panel on the right-hand side and click Send. If you need technical assistance, please direct your question to the host. Otherwise, please send your questions to all panelists. If at any time you're viewing the presentation in full screen, you can display the Q&A panel by clicking the question mark icon in your floating toolbar, usually found in the lower right corner of your screen. At the end of this session, a short survey about today's presentation will pop up. We greatly appreciate your feedback. At this time, I'd like to introduce our host for today, Dan Gerson. Dan?
Thank you. Hello and welcome everyone to the Cisco Support Community. Today we present a live Cisco Support Community Expert Series webcast. Our topic today, Automating Cisco iOS Vulnerability Assessment. My name is Dan Gerson, and I'll be moderating today's event. Our expert joining me today is Omar Santos. Omar is an incident manager with Cisco's Product Security Incident Response Team. He has designed, implemented, and supported numerous secure networks for Fortune 500 companies and the U.S. government, including the U.S. Marine Corps and the U.S. Department of Defense. He is also the author of many Cisco online technical documents and configuration guidelines. Prior to his current role, he was a technical leader with the Worldwide Security Practice and Cisco's Technical Assistance Center, where he taught, led, and mentored many engineers within the organizations. He is an active member of the InfraGard organization. InfraGard is a cooperative undertaking between the FBI and the Association of Business Academic Institutions, state and local law enforcement agencies, and other participants that is dedicated to increasing the security of the critical infrastructures of the United States of America. Omar has also delivered numerous technical presentations to Cisco customers and partners, as well as executive presentations to CEOs, CIOs, and CSOs of many organizations. Welcome, Omar.
Thank you, Dan. And I would like to,
No problem. Our expert panelists today are both our CCIEs, Panos Kampanikis and Tim Semut. They will help in answering some of your technical questions during today's event. Now I'd like to briefly outline the format for today's expert series event. Omar will start with a presentation on Cisco Oval for the first hour of the program, and then he will provide an answer to the question, what do the Beatles, Rolling Stones, and Cisco Oval all have in common? Stay tuned for that. Then we'll dive into the live question submission from the audience for the remainder of the event. During our live presentation, you may submit your technical questions to be answered by Omar and the expert panelists using the Q&A box on the right side of your console. The team of technical experts is well versed in Cisco Oval, so please begin posting your questions now to give us the best chance of answering them. If you experience any technical issues, please post those questions into the chat. We'll be asking polling questions during today's webcast, and we do encourage you to participate by answering them. Also, today, if you'd like to download a copy of today's PDF presentation, you can do so using the link in the chat window. Today's webcast will also be recorded for replay within the next 5 business days. Additionally, everyone who joins today's webcast will receive 125 Cisco Preferred Access points. Now, let's get started with today's event. We'll kick things off with a polling question. Do you currently subscribe to security vulnerability announcements and notifications from Cisco? A, yes. No, where can I get this information about receiving this information? C, no, not interested. D, I did not know that Cisco publishes security vulnerability content. Please take a moment to answer on the right side. Don't forget, you can submit your questions at any time during today's event. This will give Omar and his team enough time to prep them and answer them. Now I'd like to pass the mic over to Omar to start today's webcast. Omar?
Thank you again, Dan. And I would like to thank everybody for attending and participating on this webcast. As previously mentioned, we will try to keep this session fairly interactive. So again, I don't want to be repetitive, but please feel free to ask any questions, and Tim and Panos will be assisting me answering them. To get started, I would like to go over the agenda. We will start with a brief introduction of my team, which is the Product Security Incident Response team. We will then start with an overview of security automation technologies and standards that are currently available for customers to use, and focusing a little bit more into the Open Vulnerability and Assessment Language, otherwise known as OVAL. We will also cover another standard called CVRF later in the presentation. We will then go into talk more about what the vulnerability assessment and machine readable content strategy from Cisco currently is and what we actually see in the future. And at the end, we would like to actually do a technical deep dive and a demo of OVAL and how you can actually use our OVAL content to evaluate and do assessment in your network for iOS devices. So to get started, the PSIRT team is a global team that investigates and discloses any security vulnerability that is related to Cisco products and Cisco networks. PSIRT works with Cisco customers, independent researchers, consultants, industry organizations, and many other vendors, and often even with our competitors, to identify possible security issues within Cisco products, the networks itself, and of course, if it's in many cases, we also lead the investigation of industry-wide security problems, again, working with many organizations in the industry. You can find more information about my team and all of our security deliverables, in other words, all the security advisories that we publish, security notices and responses on and then link in the next slide, which is cisco.com/go/PSIRT. Now, to go over the process, the PSIRT process from a very high level perspective, I would like to start by saying that anybody, not only a security expert, but anybody within the industry or anybody within Cisco or outside of Cisco can report a security incident or a potential vulnerability on a Cisco product to the PSIRT team. So our process actually starts at that point. Again, we become aware of a potential vulnerability on a Cisco product, and even in some cases non-Cisco products that may affect the industry as a whole. Once we receive that security incident information or that potential vulnerability, we start our active management process on where we use security standards like the Common Vulnerability Scoring System to be able to prioritize and identify what resources are needed and how critical or how risky is that vulnerability. Once we understand the technical aspects of it and we engage the appropriate folks, we work within Cisco and in many cases, again, even outside of Cisco, to determine, and coordinate the specific fix. Not only a specific fix that customers can implement, but also to look for mitigations either within the specific device or technology, or mitigations, outside of the actual device. So in other words, mitigations in the network that customers can implement to alleviate or to mitigate the issue. Then, once we actually do that, of course, we create a communication plan based on the priority or the risk of the vulnerability. And then we publish that vulnerability either via a security advisory, which is for high severity issues, a security response in case we are responding to an industry-wide event, or security notices which are aimed for low to medium severity vulnerabilities. Then we, of course, do all the integration and mitigation information within a collateral documents as part of that communication, and of course we notify the customer simultaneously. So everybody is notified at the same time. At the end of the process, of course, we always look for feedback from customers, and that feedback, of course, goes back into a feedback loop or an input for our process, later on. This process can take hours or months, depending on the scope of the actual incident. And in other words, we always strive to, work with the security community and work internally to make sure that whenever we disclose the vulnerabilities, we do have fixes in place. But in some cases, on where the vulnerability is already being advertised by let's say a security researcher or by somebody in the industry, we may not have that much of a luxury. And again, that process, in some cases can take a day or even less. Now, all this is actually documented in our security vulnerability policy, which I have a link in this slide. And of course, we also describe the different mechanisms that we actually have for disclosing these vulnerabilities. Now, before I continue to the next session, I would like to ask you just one more question. So again, you can use the polling in the right of your screen, but the question is, how do you currently check for vulnerable devices after a security advisory is published? Either manually, you perhaps created a tool or a script to do this. You're probably leveraging commercial tools, or you simply don't or don't know how to do so. So please take a moment to actually answer that, and we will continue. Okay. Also, like we mentioned before, please feel free to submit any questions that you actually have now, and using the Q&A panel to submit your questions, and panels and team, will be able to assist you. Now, let's actually go into a little bit more technical side of things, and I would like to start giving you an introduction of what the security automation standard or body of work is right now. As you know, most security and network administrators are always seeking ways to leverage standards and available tools in order to reduce the complexity and the time necessary to respond to all these security advisories and all these publications that I mentioned before. And not only that, but also assess their devices and ensure that the network is actually compliant to security, and the posture of the networks is secure. Now, all these challenges make it almost impossible for anybody, either a security expert or network administrator, to decide what changes are needed on endpoints or networking devices or even the infrastructure as a whole. Additionally, administrators most determine how to implement those changes, not only correctly, but also quickly and, more importantly, consistent. Now, we have plenty of technologies that have been evolving throughout the years that are unfortunately closed solutions, right? So, Cisco may have one, the next, vendor may have another one, a private organization, a public organization may have another one, but those typically were closed solutions. Now we're trying to evolve this process and evolve this maturity, adopting different interoperability standards or different standards for security automation that hopefully will evolve into mature implementations that will support customers throughout the board, throughout the industry in a more consistently, again, and an effective method. What we define right now that the industry perception of automation and the security automation right now is like we're pretty much around here where this arrow is pointing right now. And the reason is because we do have several standards that are being used by customers, that are being used by the industry, that are being used by vendors. But we do have, of course, a road ahead of us. Now, the good news is, the sky is the limit, right? So we have from the simplest, task of machine readable content on where, a device or or a tool can absorb all these security notices and reports and advisories, all the way to how potential mitigation can take place automatically in the network, right? Now, as far as Cisco is always committed to protect customers by sharing all this critical security-related information in many, many different formats. What we started recently is that we started the adoption of two more mature standards that we have right now in the industry. One is OVAL, the Open Vulnerability and Assessment language, which is led by and maintained by MITRE. We're now including definitions for all Cisco IOS security advisories. We currently support iOS, and I explain why a little bit later, but we also enhancing the language to support other technologies and other product sets within Cisco. So what OVAL does is actually provides a very structured and standard way, a machine readable content that allows customers to consume the security vulnerability information that we publish, and of course identify those affected devices. The OVAL can also be used in many other different ways. For example, you can use it to verify not only that patches or fixes are available, but you can also use it to verify that a device is actually configured based on a configuration best practice, in other words, or based of following a secure configuration, or in some cases configuration templates that allows you to have a consistency within your network. Now, all the OVAL content can be downloaded from each security advisory, and I'll explain that and I show you that later in the presentation. And it's completely free. So this is actually something that of course we're doing not only because we're good citizens, but because we're extremely committed to protect customers, and that's the number one mission, especially for my team, for the PSIRT team. Now, the other standard that we're adopting right now is the Common Vulnerability Reporting Framework. That's a standard that supports. It's also a machine readable format. It supports vendors to publish security advisories in an XML format. That standard was designed by an organization called ICASI, the Industry Consortium for Advancement of Security in the Internet. Cisco is a member and took a major role in its development. As a matter of fact, I will explain, what ICASI is in the next slide. ICASI is a global consortium, if you will, and I know that's actually word is part of the title, but it's a group of companies, member companies, that the main mission is to not only look for things on how to better protect our customers and how to better exchange information regarding security potential threats and vulnerabilities, but also to look for ways that we can mitigate them, in very short word, make the internet a better place. Now, as you see, we actually have several member companies. I'm not going to go into every single one of them. Cisco, of course, has a major role in that organization, and we have companies from online retail to vendors, cloud providers, and of course, as you see here, even some cases, we collaborate even with our competitors and challengers out there. Now, the goal of CVRF is very, very easy. Is basically to make sure that we have a way of consuming that vulnerability documentation in a organized and in a machine-readable way. I do have, we do have a lot of materials about CVRF and, of course, the implementation at many resources online. A good resource is a series of blog posts created by one of my colleagues, Mike Schiffman, and I have a link in here. And we also have a white paper of the newer version of CVRF, which is 1.1, that can also be downloaded from the link at this page. Now, I would like to give you an example of how the XML in CVRF actually works, and examples on how you can digest that information. But before I do that, I want to advertise a tool that, as a matter of fact, Mike Schiffman, my colleague that I mentioned before, he actually created, and it's called a CVRF Parser. That tool allows you, it's an open source tool and allows you to actually digest the content and manipulate it however many ways you can. And I explain, how you can do that. Again, the tool is an open source package. It can be downloaded from the Python package index or also can be checked out from GitHub. In this slide at the bottom, I actually have a link to a blog that he published, regarding this specific tool. And in here, of course, I'm just showing you how you can actually install just with the pip command from the Python package index command to install the package. Now the CVRF parse tool has many different options. Again, you can manipulate the content as you will. The sky is the limit. Basically, in CVRF, the documents are structured, and that white paper that I mentioned earlier, of course, has all the technical details and dictionaries and all the different elements within the document that is included in the CVRF standard. But you can manipulate, things like the CVSS score, the score that I mentioned before that we used to calculate the risk of the vulnerabilities, or you can, manipulate the summary of the vulnerability, the identifiers like the CVE, the common vulnerability enumerators, and many other things. You can also get information about remediation workarounds and things like that. Again, this is just for your reference. All the options of the CVRF parse that, of course, supports align with the standard itself. Now, I would like to give you somewhat of a high-level example, without going into too much technical details in here, of how you can actually use this tool to parse or even validate some of these documents, or in this case it's a Cisco Security Advisory published in March of this year. And the reason that I know that is because, as you can see from the screen right here, for all the security advisories we use this nomenclature. Cisco SA means the security advisory, the actual date that was published, and typically the technology that affected, or the product that was affected. And the CVRF.xml, of course, extension is that this is actually a CVRF XML document that was published, or the version of the XML document of that advisory. Now, the CVRF parse is a command. You specify a file, and in this case, we're just validating that the actual XML file is valid against the schema of CVRF. Now, a little bit better example is whenever you want to manipulate some of the data of the advisory. In this example, we're actually displaying only the document title. Of course, it's all a dump of everything that is within that document. Of course, the title is Cisco IOS Software IP Service Level Agreement Vulnerability. And the actual document publisher, which is this case, of course, we were the ones that published the document, which is a vendor, and we have all the information related to the PSIRT team and Cisco's organizational information in there. Another example that I have here is dumping, just the document references. In other words, we typically publish, in some cases, when available, we publish collateral documents, and we reference other, documents that may allow customers to respond to these vulnerabilities and may allow customers to mitigate the specific vulnerability using infrastructure devices. In this case, for that advisory, for that IPSLA advisory, there was an apply mitigation bulletin, which in this example we're actually just displaying, and that's what the document references a keyword is for displaying that. And again, another example is getting the scores from the actual advisory. In this case, the score was a 7.8 for the base CVSS score and a temporal score of 6.4. Now, at the end of the presentation, I'm mentioning a lot of things like scoring and how our advisories are structured, how the CVRF, of course, schemas are organized. At the end of the presentations, I actually have a slide that has a summary with many different references to white papers and, of course, different standards like CVSS and enumerators like CVE and so on and so forth. So if you don't understand this or don't have any experience with all these terminologies or different standards, we'll definitely have a list of references at the end for your benefit. Now, changing gears a little bit, now that we mentioned CVRF, of course, again, helps you manipulating some of this data. A lot of the use cases for CVRF, currently use cases, are other security vendors as well that actually can take this data to provide new functionality within tools. There's actually several organizations actually out there not only now publishing CVRF content but also digesting the CVRF content to enhance the tools and to enhance the automation or the assessment of devices. But where the assessment part comes from or comes to is more into that OVAL language that I mentioned before. Now, OVAL is part of a bigger movement or a bigger set of standards called SCAP. And SCAP stands for Security Content Automation Protocol. It was actually created by the U.S. public sector, and it's currently maintained by MITRE, but it's gaining a lot of international adoption. The main goal was to provide a standard solution for security automation as a whole, by ensuring that, of course, we implement and verify configuration best practices within our networks, but also that we verify the presence of patches and at the end of the day, maintaining a complete visibility of all of the security posture of the systems within the organization. This is not only for network devices. Of course, OVAL and SCAP can actually be used for pretty much everything. You can, think from assessing an end-host, workstation, let's say a Windows machine or a Mac machine running Mac OS X, all the way to now adopting new schemas to support mobile devices like Apple iOS and Android. Now, I do have a lot of things for your reference in here that I'm not going to go and of course, read. But SCAP has many components. Every time that you see this little book, again, is for your reference. But SCAP has many components. OVAL is one of the major components in there. Again, OVAL is maintained by MITRE. All the specifications about the language you can obtain it from this link. As a matter of fact, just within the attendees, I noticed that there's some participants from MITRE in here as well. They're a very open group and always willing to help. They can also, there's contact information about how you can reach out to the OVAL team and the OVAL different aliases, developer aliases and so on and so forth in that link. I'm actually part of the OVAL board representing Cisco. And again, there's always an open communication there. Again, there's many other different standards within it. I am not going to go into every single one of them. The one that I want to highlight is the Extensible Configuration Checklist Description Format. That's a mouthful, or otherwise known as XCCDF. It's actually a standard specification to collect all these checklists and benchmarks and definitions that in this case can that are documented in an OVAL document or machine readable content. This this specification, of course, organizes it into the way that can actually be consumed, and it can be grouped into the way that customers can easily identify either a configuration best practice or malpractice, or the presence of a patch or a vulnerability on the system. The other ones, again, are for your references. The one that I mentioned before is also the Common Vulnerability and Exposures Identifier. That's very widely not only known but used by many organizations out there. In other words, this is actually how vulnerabilities are identified in a very standard way across the industry right now. And the other one is a Common Platform Enumerator, which is also a standard naming convention to identify either operating system applications or hardware devices from vendors. There's, again, many other components on that. I'm not going to go, for the sake of time, into a lot of details in there, but I would like to jump into what specifically is OVL, how can you use it, and why Cisco is actually supporting it. There are many use cases, for OVL, but the four major ones, or the main ones, are to determine if the device is affected by a given vulnerability, to, of course, check for compliance, use it for somewhat of an inventory check, in other words, to check for a specific version of software that is installed in the system, or at the end of the day, of course, to see if the specific patch is on the system or not, or if what is the posture of that device. OVL has many components. I mentioned the definitions. Definitions are just basically XML files that are used to check the presence of the vulnerability or the configuration best practice on that device. Like any XML, of course, there are schemas. Those schemas are the building blocks, if you can call it like that, of those XML documents, and they define all the elements and attributes and data types that are part of that OVL language definition. I have an example here, how OVL checks for affected devices and affected configurations in a network device. Let's say in iOS, how can you check if you have access control list configure, if you're running a specific version of software, but if you're configuring a way that perhaps you're vulnerable or not vulnerable to or affected by a given vulnerability. Again, there's many other components within OVL. I think what it makes a little bit better sense is this slide in here. Of course, there's a document, machine readable document. You need a tool to be able to create that document, whether you create the XML file by hand, which is not that convenient, or you adopt a tool, or you create a tool to author that XML file. In our case, of course, Cisco has internal tools that we use to get the information from the security advisories and transpose it or translate it into OVL definitions. Our repository, in our case, of course, is cisco.com, but an OVL definition can be fed either directly from the authoring tool to a definition repository, or from the authoring tool to an evaluator. And an evaluator is basically, there's a couple of parts within an evaluator, but an evaluator is a program or a system that will be making the assessment, against that given device or end host, and giving that result to an end customer. And this end consumer or end customer may be a security auditor, maybe a security, of course, administrator or a network administrator. Now, within that, there's many things that actually, of course, take place. There's what we call the OVL system characteristics, which is all the information about the specific device that is being evaluated, and of course, information on how to evaluate the device is what is part of the OVL definitions. There are several definition evaluators, so what we call scanners, out on the industry. To mention a couple, OpenSCAP is an open source tool, and Jobel, which is actually an open source tool that we use here at Cisco to not only validate our content, but to make sure that our content can be easily consumed by customers and in an effective way. I'll explain how to use this content later in the presentation and how to use Jobwell to not only to validate the content, but of course to make an assessment of the device. What I want to highlight before I jump into that is how you can download these definitions for both OVL and CVRF. I mentioned earlier that you can get them directly from each iOS advisory in case of OVL definitions. And in case of CVRF, you can also download it in any advisories. CVRF is supported in all technologies. These two arrows are, of course, pointing to the download links. As part of the iOS security a process or advisory publication, for those publications for Cisco iOS, we create events response pages or ERPs, and those are a summary of all the vulnerabilities that are actually being published and everything. OVL definitions are also part of, or the links to the OVL definitions are also part of that report or that events response page. And you can, of course, also download the OVL definitions from there as well. Now, again, this is just an example of a recent advisory that we published. The link to that advisory is in the bottom of the screen and also within the advisory as well. So you can play with it and, of course, download the definitions from there right after this the webcast. Now, to give an example of the actual XML, actually before that, let me take a step back and talk about something that I briefly mentioned before, which is the internalization of different standards, specifically of SCAP, moving from the public sector to a more international audience. There's a lot of appeal, an international appeal, as other countries are actually recognizing the value of SCAP and the value of OVL. And because of that, of course, there's a lot of efforts in many technical bodies. So one of the questions that I always get all the time is SCAP or OVL or even CVRF an RFC or a lot of the networking guys, of course, they're very familiar with RFCs, but they're not familiar with other standards that are actually emerging right now. So there's a lot of efforts to actually take this to an international body. IETF is actually being considered, not only for OVL and XCCDF and some of these initial candidates, but other security automation work such as CVRF as well. Now, one thing that I wanted to highlight that has changed in the last few months is that I mentioned that OVL currently is only supported for Cisco iOS advisories. The reason for that is because there was only an initial schema or schemata for OVL that supported Cisco iOS. Cisco actually took a little bit more active role. I mentioned that my team, PSIRT, but our greater organization, the Security Research and Operations Group within Cisco, which Tim and Panos are a member of, we took an active role and enhanced the iOS schema, also created schemas for new products such as Cisco ASA and Cisco iOS XE. Of course, like many other standards, this takes some time for the next, release to be available. But right now, the next OVL language, which is expected to be available by the end of this year, will have support for both iOS XE and ASA products as well. This is just for your reference as far as the timeline. Again, this is actually based on the timeline that is published in the MITRE's website. But we're looking into that next version of OVL, which is the 5.11, to be sometime at the end of this year. Now, before I go into the technical details and talk a little bit more about the OVL standards and how you can use it in your environment, let me actually ask you one more question. The question is, do you currently use any type of automation, anything, to assess, security vulnerabilities in your network? The answer can be as simple as no, or I'm not sure, or yes, I actually look for or use proprietary or commercial tools, or, of course, I'm using currently security standards like OVL or CVRF on the network. Just take a minute and answer that question, if you don't mind, in the polling section here in WebEx. And at the same time, please feel free to submit any questions now to our Q&A panel. So I'll give you a minute to respond. Okay. Now, then, the next section, what I want to do is probably what you have been waiting patiently for, is the example on how you can actually do an assessment on an iOS device using OVL. For my example, I will use a very high level or very simplistic topology. I'm going to have a machine running an OVL scanner, in this case Jovel, the open source tool that I mentioned before. And to my right, I have a router that we just call it R1 with, of course, configure with a specific IP address, in this case 172.18.122.246. And to go over the technical details of the actual vulnerability that we're going to be checking for is a vulnerability that we published last year. This is the CVE, or the identifier for the vulnerability, and it was a vulnerability or security advisory that addressed an issue that affected the Cisco IOS IKE, or Internet Key Exchange implementation. R1 in this case, it is configured for IPsec, and it is running an effective version of code for that given advisory. And this is very high level, an excerpt of that configuration for R1 for IKE. Of course, we define the specific, crypto ISAK-MP policies, or the IKE policies. We have a crypto map. In this case, is a site-to-site tunnel where the peer is, 10.10.10.10 in here. We're matching, of course, an ACL to the crypto map. Of course, I'm assuming that you already know how to configure IKE. In this case, it's just for example. We have plenty of references on how to configure IKE or IPsec, but I wanted to just demonstrate that the device is, of course, configured for IPsec, and is listening to IKE UDP port 500, and that the configuration is, of course, active in that router. Now, the tool that I mentioned that we're going to be using is Jovel. In this example, the XML file, or the OVL definition file name, is this one right here. Of course, the security advisory, the CVE identifier, and OVL and XML. The file resides in a directory on that machine that is called definitions. So if you look at the actual Jovel command, Jovaldi is a batch file that is actually used by Jovel to do the assessment. So the command is actually jovaldi.bat. In this case, we're using the remote plugin to connect and scan the router remotely. And we're defining that the definition is stored in the definitions directory, and we give the file name for that OVL definition. Now, this is the output of what the tool actually does. Initially, of course, it validates the XML against the OVL schema. It goes down into connecting to the device. In this case, the Jovel machine, or the machine that is running Jovel, is connecting to the router via SSH, and is obtaining all the information about the device, based on that OVL definition. So looking to see not only if it's actually running an effective version of code, but if it's actually configured, in this case, for IKE. Since that actually was the case, you will get at the bottom, or now you get at the bottom, the results that equals true. True means that the device is actually vulnerable. And of course, it creates an XML, and it can also create an HTML report, just like this one, and where it tells you a specific, what was the IP addresses of the device, what was the operating system version. In this case, 15.1.3t was running into that that iOS router was running 15.1.3t. Of course, it goes into the specific versions and a timestamp where we actually ran this scan, and of course the results of that vulnerability assessment. In this case, it's true, and the device is actually vulnerable. It gives you a reference of the actual advisory that disclose that given vulnerability, and many other references regarding the device. Now, this is another example of the same report, but in this case, we disable IPsec on that router, so that makes the device not vulnerable, right? So since the device is not configured for IPsec, now you have as a result of false. So it's still running the same exact version, but the value add in here is that Oval, and in this case Jovel, the tool, it's intelligent enough to verify if the device is configured in a way that makes it affected by that given vulnerability, even though of course you're running that version of code. That eliminates a lot of false positive, and many things are out there only checks for, of course, the version of the device, but don't check for the actual configuration of that device. In Oval, and in this case, the tool Jovel, it allows you to actually check. And again, the sky is the limit. There's many different ways that, just this example, that you can configure IPsec. And in this case, of course, Cisco, the Security Research and Operations team, we create that definition for you already with the specific configuration options or capabilities of the in this case the router that makes it either affected or not affected. Now I want to do a quick demo. So while I change gears in a minute, basically is very similar, but at least it gives you put things into perspective a little bit better than just a couple of slides with the output of the command. In this case, I will be playing the video and I will stop in them and I'll explain what we have. In the right, we have a router where we have an IP address of 172.18.122.246 configured there, and the vulnerability that we're gonna be checking is for a vulnerability on the NAT implementation of iOS. So if you look before, what we had in here is that we have the router configured for NAT, and we're running an effective version of code for that given vulnerability. Now on the left in here, we have a machine running a Jovel. This is a Windows machine. Jovel is supported either on Windows or Linux, just in this example, just for simplicity, where you're using the Windows version of it. And we have the configuration is to connect to that router, the 172.18.122.246 router. And of course, we specify the username and password that we're going to be connecting. Of course, this is a lab environment, so the password and the username is very simplistic. Do not recommend to use that Cisco password, but just for our demo, we have it here. And we have a definition directory, like I mentioned before, on where we store all the Oval definitions. Now, as you saw before, we invoked the Jovaldi batch file, the Jovaldi command, using the remote plugin, and we point to the definitions directory and to the file, the OVAL file that would be used for this assessment. Once we invoke that, you see the tool, doing, of course, its thing and start parsing the XML file, validates the file against the schema, and it starts to create what we call the OVAL system characteristic file, or the characteristics of the system. And at the end, you see that the result was true. That means that the device was indeed vulnerable. One, because it was running the 15.1.3t version of code, which is the version that that vulnerability affects, and also that it was running NAT in this case. Now, again, here I'm highlighting that the results are true, and if you look at the HTML file that was generated, we see that the results is true, and that we are affected by that given vulnerability, and highlighted in that CVE and that advisory. Now, for demonstration purposes, what I'm going to do here on the router is I'm unconfigure a NAT. So I'm going to disable NAT on that router just to show you how the OVAL is actually capable of checking for the configuration state of that machine. And now we should get a results equals false. So the results should be false. That means that the device is no longer vulnerable to that given vulnerability. And that's what you will see just a second in here. So if you see here, we have a false as the result, and of course the HTML file also has a false, so the device is not affected. Okay, changing gears a little bit. I mentioned earlier in the presentation, of course, that I had many different resources and links to those resources at the end of the presentation. Just to highlight a few, the first one is a white paper that I actually personally created that has the details of all the SCAP components, step-by-step instructions on how to use the OVAL content. It actually even has the examples, similar examples of what you just saw here. So, of course, I know that it's a lot to digest, and with some of these demos, we go fairly quickly, but that white paper has the step-by-step details on how you can actually not only become familiar with these emerging standards, but also how to take advantage of our machine readable contents. We have also an FAQ that hopefully will help you answer some of those common questions that you may have regarding security automation and regarding, of course, our machine content strategy. And we have, of course, a series of blog posts and other technical documentations that are available for you. And always, of course, feel free to stop by the support forums and ask any questions you may actually have. We will have an Ask the Expert session right after this webcast, to answer any questions that you may still have. And again, I would like to thank you, for your time today. But before we move on, I would like to pass it over to Dan, and we will ask you one last question. So, Dan?
Thank you, Omar. All right, let's get to our fourth polling question. How long does it currently take for you to identify affected devices, identify workarounds or mitigations, and deploy fixes after a vulnerability is announced in a Cisco product? Is it A, a week, B, a month, C, 2 to 3 months, D, more than 3 months, or E, not sure? Go ahead and answer on the right side. So we're going to be moving into the Q&A portion of today's webcast. If you still do have a question that you'd like to ask Omar or his team of experts, please do submit that right now, and we can get to that. Oh, well, we'll get to the trivia question in a second, but give everyone a second to finish answering that question. And let's get to the trivia question. And we're going back in time here to select the answer to the question we asked earlier. What do the Rolling Stones, the Beatles, and Cisco Oval have in common? All right, and we'll get to that answer in a little bit. Okay, moving into the Q&A portion. We can get started with our first question.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah, so
first question here is, how often does Cisco publish a full collection of CVE Oval content? Not just individual Oval entries for a specific CVE, but a full collection.
Yeah, so just to understand the question, how often does Cisco publish a full collection of Oval content? So Oval again is currently supported by Cisco for Cisco IOS only, Cisco IOS publications only, so security advisories. So every time now that we publish a security advisory, we do publish an Oval definition when it can be. There's some scenarios, very, very rare scenarios, where we cannot check for the device compliance or the device configuration, whether the commands, are there by default, and there's no way to the device is listening to a specific port by some configurations or some dependencies. But even though in those cases we will publish an Oval definition for version checks, right? Now, but to answer the question short, every time that there's a security advisory for Cisco IOS, we will publish Oval content for that specific CVE. Now, the second part of the question, not only for individual Oval entries, for a full collection of CVEs. Now, I mentioned that every time that we publish a security advisory bundle for iOS, because we do that twice a year, we publish an ERP document, an event stream response pages. That document summarizes all the vulnerabilities or all the CVEs that are part of that bundle publication, and it also has the ability for customers to download the files from there. Now we're working on potential future enhancements on where you can download every file or every Oval definitions that were published earlier, but currently, it's only available either through the advisory or through the ERP page. Okay.
Okay, excellent. Another question here: are other authentication methods supported, or is it just username and password?
Yeah. So the tool that I was showing there is, of course, it's an open source tool. That is called Jovo. In that case, of course, we were connecting to a router that was, in my case, configured with a local database, but of course it can be configured for an external authentication such as radios or TAGX and so on. Now, the tool supports the ability to connect to a router either via SSH or either via SNMP. And in this case, I was actually connecting over SSH. Of course, that's why you saw the username and password. There, the language itself, it doesn't dictate how you connect itself to the device. Of course, depends on the tool. It's just, that in this case, I was actually just using SSH, and that's the reason that you saw the username and password there.
Okay, next question. Will the management of this be incorporated in Mars or another product?
Yeah, and I just saw another question that was somewhat related, so I'll try to answer both at the same time, which is, the other one was, is it possible to use cvrfparse or any Oval compatible tools combined with Cisco Prime LMS, or should we acquire different piece of software? Which is basically the same question, just phrased a little bit different correctly. The CVRFparse is just a reference implementation for CVRF. Of course, it's not a commercial product. It's actually a tool that was created by my team, but it can be used not only by Cisco but other vendors. Currently, we do not support. This, of course, is an emerging technology. We do not support it with Cisco Prime LMS or Mars as we speak. We do have capabilities with Prime LMS and Mars to check for the vulnerabilities in a different way, but the end goal is to have that to have the whole industry support this machine readable content, and it doesn't matter if it's a Cisco Prime LMS software, an open source tool, or a commercial tool that may not be a Cisco tool, to be able to digest this content. At the end of the day, of course, what we want to do is to have the ability for customers to be able to protect themselves. Of course, Cisco Prime LMS already has some functionality that can allow you to do that. But in this case, of course, the OVAL content, and there are many other, not only Cisco, but of course many other vendors that are now jumping into the OVAL adoption, the machine readable content adoption, and you will expect a lot of future support. I mentioned Jovo, is the prime example of it. That's of course from an open source perspective, and they do have a commercial license agreement for support as well. But there are of course many others out there that are looking to implement not only the OVAL but are implementing it right now and supporting them, but only OVAL but also CVRF. Okay.
Is OVAL only for routers, or does it have value on layer 2 switches as well?
Yeah, so OVAL is not, and I'll take the answer a little bit to another level. OVAL is not only for network devices. OVAL is to check for either the compliance or the vulnerability assessment and things like that outside of even networking devices. In case of iOS, of course, depending on the vulnerability, you may be actually checking against a router or against a switch, let's say a Cat 6500 that is actually running Cisco iOS. But it doesn't end there. The OVAL language, of course, supports host operating systems like Microsoft and Red Hat and many others. And I can mention before, the community is also trying to take it to the next level where we actually are checking for mobile devices as well, such as iPhones and Android devices.
Okay, excellent. Yeah. In the demo, you showed that one CVE at a time. Is it possible to test multiple CVEs at once?
Yes, absolutely. So the demo, of course, was very simplistic. I just wanted to not overcomplicate things. But again, the sky is the limit. You can automate and you can bundle all the definitions into one directory or multiple directories. Create or script the way. In my case, I was using, of course, Jovo, but you can script that way. You can, of course, also use it or run it in other operating systems like Linux, and make it a lot more. You can either check for one device and all the definitions, or check one definitions for multiple devices, or of course all the definitions against several devices as well. So again, the sky's the limit in there. And depending on the tool, and depending, of course, the implementation, so whether it's my simplistic case of an open source tool, or whether you have a commercial tool that supports this, it of course it all depends on the capabilities of that tool as well.
Okay. Are you planning to create OVAL content for all advisories or only for new ones?
Yeah, so when we started doing the OVAL adoption last year, we of course started in September of last year. It was actually September 26th. I remember the date as if it was today. Now we created all OVAL content for all the advisories all the way back to March of 2010. So we went several years back. We're not planning, of course, that that information may not be that relevant right now. But plus, we didn't have a lot of the capabilities in the language or in the tools to be able to create the older advisories. But right now, we're supporting anything from March 2010 onwards. Now, having said that, that's in Cisco IOS. Now, like I mentioned before, OVAL, is a security standard, and it's based on XML. And because it's based on XML, it needs schemas. The next two products that we created the schemas and that we're gonna be potentially supporting is a Cisco ASA and iOS XC. Now, of course, throughout the whole process is not only a Cisco-only process. Of course, many vendors are creating schemas and functionality in the language itself. We will, continue to enhance our support, and we will continue to, expand that support to other products such as, NXOS and, other products that we may have. But currently, we're supporting Cisco iOS and prioritizing and already created schemas for ASA and iOS XC.
Okay. Omar's example was for a CVE violation. Do you have an example for a configuration best practices violation? For example, a telnet-enabled device encoded in OVAL.
Correct. Yeah. Unfortunately, in this one, I was concentrating more into the vulnerability assessment. But yes, the language specifically, now for iOS, it supports for you to check anything. You can even create your own. This is of course for the more technical savvy. You can create even your own OVAL definitions to check for anything. Let's say a configuration best practice or even a configuration template that you may have within the organization, and you want to make sure that all the devices, let's say, as an example, all your internet-facing routers that you have anti-spoofing capabilities or anti-spoofing ACLs out there, or that you have a specific set of infrastructure ACLs to protect your, that is mostly environmental driven. Of course, you can create that and use, like the tools that I mentioned before to even check on that. There's also the public sector, and specifically the U.S. government, has a set of standards of configuration best practices I call STIGs. They are actually different teams, within the industry creating definitions that are for STIGs and similar things. So again, I didn't have an example specifically for the lack of time to show you for configuration best practice, but the logic is pretty much the same. Of course, depending on the tool and the capabilities, you will connect to the device and obtain that configuration information. Not only from parsing a configuration. In a lot of cases, what we're doing is even collecting the output of commands or show commands, in other words, that allows you to see more things of the state of the machine. For example, if the device is not only configuring many different ways for specific technology, but if it's indeed listening to a specific port, or if it's indeed functioning or in a state that either makes it compliant or not compliant, or vulnerable or not vulnerable. Hopefully that makes sense.
Okay, very good. Another question here. Are there any open source tools that support OVAL?
Yes, so of course, the vivid example is the one that I just used, Jovo. That is an open source tool. Of course, there's depending on the level of support and the level of scanning that you want to do, there's different options for Jovo. Another one that is in the industry, but slowly adopting networking devices is OpenSCAP. But the primary open source tool right now that is available is Jovo, the one that I mentioned before.
Okay. How can I validate a CVRF document?
So the CVRF parse tool that I mentioned before is the reference implementation where you can actually validate it. Of course, CVRF, just like OVAL, is an XML document. In case of CVRF, you can use other open source tools like XML-Lint and many others that you can validate the structure of the document. To validate and use and parse and manipulate the CVRF data, of course, cvrfparse is one of the primary tools out there, developed by Mike Schiffman from my group.
Okay. Is there any other Cisco Press product or training tutorial that goes through OVAL usage?
Unfortunately, not yet. And I'm not committing to write a book yet, but just kidding. Basically, the OVAL, CVRF, and many other, we're just talking about two of the standards, but there's many others actually emerging as we speak right now. A lot of movements and changes and adoption. There's no Cisco Press books or yet for that. The adoption, like I mentioned in one of the previous slides, we're somewhat in between migrating from those closed solutions into adopting these new standards and developing the new standards. Once things, are a little bit more mature and implementation is more pervasive, I can assure you that may be a lot more. The resources that I mentioned at the end of the presentation on that previous slide, that of course has many different information about the implementations of and reference architecture for each of the languages and each of the implementations, but unfortunately there's no Cisco Press books. The other thing, of course, we're committed, and also one of the reasons that we're doing this type of webcast and opening more for better opening forums and publishing blog posts and increasing the awareness and also receiving feedback regarding on how we can not only in the Cisco side, but how can we improve security automation as a whole, whether it's OVAL, CVRF, or many others that you may actually be using right now. And we want to promote this active collaboration and these active discussions. So if you either are currently investigating to using security automation or currently even using closed solutions like, the Cisco Prime LMS is an example of them, or, third parties as well, and have ideas on how we can actually improve, please participate on this type of events. And again, we also have the Ask the Expert event following this webcast in the support community. And also from time to time, just as far as CVRF, just 2 days ago we published, yesterday, not 2 days ago, just yesterday we published a blog post, which I actually have a link for that series, and where we are actually asking for more feedback regarding, how we can, how you're using CVRF, how we can change CVRF, how do you see the use cases, being evolving, and things like that. So I definitely invite you to participate on those.
Excellent. Thank you, Omar. That's going to conclude today's Q&A portion of today's event. And we definitely appreciate your feedback. The team definitely wants to hear from you. Those who fill out the evaluation survey will be entered to win a raffle of a $50 Amazon gift card. You'll see that evaluation pop up once you close the event. As Omar mentioned, he will be participating in the Ask the Expert event in the following 2 weeks after this webcast. That will be taking place in the Cisco Support Community Forums. You can see the link right here. And of course, you will be able to watch the entirety of this video and read the Q&A questions within 5 business days after today's event. Don't forget to join us for our upcoming webcast in English, Understanding Cisco ASR 9000 Series Aggregation Services Router Platform Architecture and Packet Forwarding Troubleshooting. That's coming up on Thursday, May 14th at 8 a.m. San Francisco time. And we have another event coming up in Polish, Secure Internet Connectivity and Multi-Layer Security. That will take place on Thursday, April 25th, 10 a.m. Warsaw time. We have one coming up in Spanish, Cisco Telepresence Management Suite Provisioning Extension. That will be on Tuesday, May 7th, 9 a.m. Mexico City time. and we have a webcast in Russian. Configuration and features of Border Gateway Protocol Prefix-Independent Convergence, Tuesday, May 21st. In Japanese, we have Cisco Catalyst High CPU Troubleshooting Training. That'll be on Tuesday, May 28th, local Japan time, or that's Tuesday the 27th, 6 p.m. San Francisco time. We have a few events right now running in English for Ask the Expert. We have Architecture and Troubleshooting, Cisco ASR 1000 Series Aggregation Service Routers. We have Configuring and Troubleshooting Uniform Resource Identifier Dialing and Intercluster Lookup Services on UCM9. And we have Deployment and Troubleshooting Cisco Unified Contact Center Express Deployments. Upcoming, we have a few Ask the Expert events, as you can see here. Fiber Channel over Ethernet, SSO with CWMS, Understanding, Configuring, and Troubleshooting IP Multicast and MVPN, and Deploying Cisco Fabric Path in the Data Center Network Fabric Path. We have a few upcoming sessions inside Cisco Live 365, April 24th, Physical to Virtual, Accelerate Migration and Simplify Operations. On May 8th, the Open Data Center, Evolution in Revolution. And on May 14th, as I mentioned before, the ASR 9000 series event. Please do participate in the Cisco support community. You can find us at supportforums.cisco.com and, of course, on all the major social networks. If English is not your favorite language, you have a choice of various other languages: Spanish, Portuguese, Japanese, Polish, or Russian. And now we get to our trivia answer. The correct answer was B. On September 26th, the Beatles released their 11th official album, Abbey Road. In September 26, 1943, Mick Jagger of the Rolling Stones was born. And September 26, 2009, Cisco releases OVAL content for Cisco iOS vulnerabilities. Thank you, everyone, for participating today. Thank you to Omar, our expert, and thank you to the question managers for helping out today. We wish everyone an excellent week. Thank you.